So I think my thinking is that the potential of electric transport allows us to rethink transport altogether. It's not just about replacing what we have, replacing a vehicle. It will be a missed opportunity if we don't all, in the rich and poor countries, rethink how we're going to design transport in urban and rural areas to serve the majority, to make our lives easier, to make women's lives easier, to make them safer.
Shantha, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast today to chat.
Great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
I was hoping you could do a little bit of an intro to yourself. So your name, your title, and the organisation that you run.
So my name's Shantha Bloeman. I'm the founder and managing director of a social enterprise called Mobility for Africa. We're essentially working to solve last mile transport needs in rural areas of Africa. We specifically started working in Zimbabwe, but with big ambitions to expand to other parts of the continent.
Maybe if you just wanted to tell us more a little bit more about Mobility for Africa. So the problems that it's trying to solve, and in particular, what difference does it make putting women in the driver's seat of mobility?
Sure. So essentially, Africa faces two big challenges. One is a huge energy deficit. So there are approximately 600 million people without adequate energy. And, as we all know, energy drives a lot of development, industry, transport, jobs. But we also face a mobility crisis. The numbers of vehicles per person is estimated on average at 44 per thousand vehicles per thousand people, which if you contrasted that with the United States, it's nearly like 800 vehicles per thousand people. So, and when you look at those averages, obviously it distorts the fact that there's a huge division between urban and rural. So much more transport. We've had a phenomenon of secondhand cars entering many African urban areas as a solution to the lack of adequate public transport. In rural areas, we've basically had to survive with people just walking long distances, carrying heavy loads. You've got the donkey, you've got the ox-drawn cart, but essentially and now you've got the motorbike. But the problem with all those types of transport is they're not actually servicing the people that need the most. And the people that need the most are rural women. Rural women spend hours of their day in drudgery, walking with, the children on the back, the 5-litre bucket of water on their head, bags of fertilizer seed to get to their field. It's a huge waste of their productive day, causes, physical hardship. A lot of the women who we work with and did a lot of focus group discussions with, I don't think they ever asked the question about how, much their muscles hurt after a long week of walking heavy long distances with heavy loads. So basically this has been a problem that I think everyone has sort of known about. I worked for the UN, UNICEF in development, went to lots of rural areas. There was always the problem of how pregnant women would get to the health clinic in time because she might live 10 kilometres from the clinic, and how was she going to get there? So, it's a huge problem if you die without getting to a clinic. It contributes to a lot of the poor health outcomes in itself. So our proposition was, with the advent of electric vehicles and the huge investment going into electric transport, how could we not use that technology and see how it could work in solving this last mile transport for women? And so we've started with the tricycle. It's an e-tricycle. It was off the shelf originally from China, but we've spent the last 5 years making it much more robust and stronger for rural Africa. We've obviously had to train local technicians and understand how to repair and service it. And we've also worked, I think that the big thing was I didn't know anything about energy. So obviously, as we now move globally to green transport, the nexus, the synergies between working with those in the energy sector is critical. You know, it often, I know from working on the policy in Zimbabwe on e-mobility, you know, people work in silos. So the Ministry of Energy very rarely speaks to the Ministry of Transport, that speaks to the Ministry of Local Government. So you've just got to go, oh my gosh. So what we've realised is if we don't have adequate energy to swap batteries, then our tricycles don't move. So we've spent a lot of investment in, one, designing a battery that's fit for purpose for rural Africa with bumpy roads. We wanted it to be a safe battery. We wanted it to take the women, you know, a decent distance, because often in the communities we work, they might want to travel 100 kilometres a day. You know, they might need to go to the clinic, to the shop, to their fields, back and forth. So we wanted to give them that distance. And we also needed to figure out how to, you know, make sure we could meet demand. So we've spent a lot of time on that. Going back to why women in the driver's seat, I think this is not just an African problem. I think globally women have been unsidelined in the design and engineering and development of transport systems. You know, in both urban and rural areas, we see high levels of discrimination against women. And to get a driver's license in Africa is very complicated. It's very expensive. And so you're automatically excluding often half the population, because they might not have control of the decision-making in a household. So the husband gets the license, the woman doesn't. Or in rural areas, the assumption is the woman can continue walking and there's no need to change that. So the tricycle isn't a motorbike, it's low speed. So the beauty is it can carry 300 to 400 kgs. We train the women how to drive it. We've been working with government on an equivalent license, but they're not driving in urban areas. And so the idea is that they can use it and share it. So it's shared transport. So we have set up fleets of between 40 and 50 tricycles. And then we have applications, and then women either are renting it as a group, a business, and using it for their business as transport, increasing their revenue, or as transport as a service. And it's amazing how the confidence of women has shifted with that control. You have this sort of change over time where attitudes that, oh, a woman can be in the driver's seat and this is not going to threaten revolution. You know, it is a revolution, but in a much more beneficial way to everyone, not just the woman who saves hours of time.
You mentioned it a little bit around the electricity and the power conversation. What's that been like, trying to manage all that the different stakeholder relationships? As you've mentioned, you know, even within government, the Department of Transport doesn't talk to the power or the electricity department. And then you've got all of those other external stakeholders from the government who are involved. What's that been like?
Like, it's required a lot of patience. Sometimes you feel like you have one conversation, then you have to repeat it again. And then always the challenge to get the right people in the room. And I mean, we worked on as a consultant on the e-mobility strategy in Zimbabwe, which has not yet passed, unfortunately. But the learning from that was that you have these very different perspectives, and the technocrats are coming at things from a different point of view. And the people in the energy space focus on energy generation, and they tend not to think about how it's actually going to be used and how it needs to be packaged in different ways. And then the people in the transport sector are always skeptical still in many African situations around electric transport, because there's a deficit of energy. So it's a chicken and egg. So they say, well, you know, why should we believe this when who's going to create the charging infrastructure? And what we've done, I think, is we've been engaged, but in some ways we had a dual strategy, which was let's just move ahead and do it. So we now build mini grids, essentially. We build rural mini grids ranging between, 20 to 50 kVA hour of energy that can charge our fleets. We choose areas where there's already connectivity to the grid. So this is a very contentious issue because, most governments know energy is a critical part of their portfolio, and energy security is a big word. So local governments are investing in rural electrification, but often it's only at a rural one stop. It's at, the little town where the shops are. Connectivity to individual houses is a very expensive proposition in rural areas. So we've been basically building our own charging systems which buy from the grid. So we're not bypassing the state utility, and then also putting in solar. We also have designed our batteries to be dual purpose, so they're storage as well as designed for rough African roads, which means we can be quite efficient, which is critical because you don't want to waste energy, which is a huge challenge we've learned. And I think what it's shown is you can do it, because I think a lot of the policymakers get caught up with the policy. And I always tell our counterparts, I worked in China before I moved back to Africa. And in China, when I was working with government stakeholders, it was always like we pilot and then we write the policy and then we scale. So for Africa, it's very, very practical advice. So what I've been doing is, why we write the policy, I'm like, let's just get on with it and show you how this can work, guys. You don't need to get paralyzed, and you don't need to just look to Europe and think, oh my God, that's the policy we need to replicate, because of course we're not Europe. So I always feel like it's sometimes the mix between having the conversations and then just showing them what can be done, even if it's on a small scale. There's a reason rural Africa has never benefited from vehicles. It's expensive, it's imported, it's controlled by vested interests, and there's no incentive to make sure rural women are benefiting from it. So this is where I get excited about the potential of green, not all green, but electric transport, to rethink how we solve these very big problems.
What do you find are the differences between running a shared mobility pilot in, say, an urban centre versus maybe in those rural areas?
So we have one of our sites is peri-urban, so it's sort of a highly densely area about 40 kilometres out of Harare, and it was very interesting because it was harder to recruit women, because a lot of the transport needs were quite different. And so we had to work much harder to bring the women into the conversation and find the right type of drivers that wanted to work in shared mobility. And we realised, okay, we needed to sort of fit women who were most probably younger, who didn't have the same household responsibilities, and had the time and could benefit from that income. I think urban is obviously, there's more obviously road traffic. And one of the challenges is that Zimbabwe in particular doesn't like two-wheelers, like motorbikes. If you go to Kenya, you'll see thousands of motorbikes, bodabodas providing motorbike transport, which is fine, except a bit hazardous. And usually that's sort of men, sitting on the street waiting for a ride. In Southern Africa, we're much more conservative, and we don't like the idea of two-wheelers clogging up the streets. So what you find is, though, the policymakers often just focus on urban, and they write regulation for urban. And what I've been trying to tell them is you need to distinguish different parameters for rural, because 70% of the roads are not sealed roads. They're rural off-road roads. So if you create the same rules, you're going to create barriers to entry for our rural women, because, accessing a motorbike license is a very difficult proposition. So I think there's a real bias towards focusing on, the elite that drive their cars around. They're worried about a whole different type of problem. And it's one of my frustrations in public transport, especially because in Africa we're sort of losing that battle, because people will buy a cheap secondhand car and drive and clog up the roads and traffic gets terrible rather than, and the capital investment you often need for public transport systems is very high. So instead you have policies being written by for a few, with a transport system that doesn't serve the majority. We need to really promote in urban planning the integration of transport, which I think in many African cities, there's been sort of a sprawl. Cities were built, 50 years ago, and the incentives for shared transport need to be, instead of it being seen as a threat, we need to really incentivize new thinking in shared transport.
Yeah, yeah. Changing track slightly. So you were part of a program run by a Canadian mobility agency called Movmi, and the program is called EmpowerWISM, which focuses on women in shared mobility. Could you talk a little bit about how that experience was for you, and the value to you and your business of going through a program like EmpowerWISM?
Yeah. Well, I think, what's been so amazing about being part of this network is the solidarity in some ways. You face all these big problems and you think you're alone, and, there's the skeptics that make you feel like you're crazy.
Yep.
So I think the big thing with connecting was that just the immediate sense of solidarity that they gave, in sense that you're not crazy. This is great. Look what other people are doing. There's other people trying different things. There's this network of, a global network of people that believe in rethinking transport. It's been a long-standing relationship and it's been very, very valuable. We need this sort of network globally because we all face sort of similar vested interests in resisting the change. I mean, the big OEMs are very powerful. The fossil fuel, petrol industries are very powerful. And they're powerful in our local context. And sometimes we forget the linkages. So to me, just having the solidarity, but the creative exchange has been very valuable. And obviously for us, winning the prize this year was very important because it gives us credibility and recognition. So I'm extremely grateful for the linkages, and we've been on this journey for a long time. I thought it would be much faster. I thought it was obvious. Like that's the thing I think with transport. You think it's so bloody obvious. Why isn't everyone just catching on the bandwagon and we're moving? So it's been much slower, which sometimes can be very hard. So having friends and people that don't think you're crazy is great.
As someone who also runs a startup, yeah, I think that does help, having people who support you and don't make you feel like you're being gaslit by society for having this random radical kind of left field idea. Got a club going. So we've chatted about quite a number of things today, and a lot of them have been quite important. So if you had to kind of distill everything that we've talked about today into like one key little snippet, one key takeaway that you wish people would have from this conversation, what do you think it would be?
So I think my thinking is that the potential of electric transport allows us to rethink transport altogether. It's not just about replacing what we have, replacing a vehicle. It will be a missed opportunity if we don't all, in the rich and poor countries, rethink how we're going to design transport in urban and rural areas to serve the majority, to make our lives easier, to make women's lives easier, to make them safer. Yeah, we have to, it's not obvious to the people in decision-making power. So we need to keep on reminding them, think out of the box. This is an opportunity to experiment with new types of transport models. To me, what we're doing in Zim is a microcosm of the potential if people use this huge investment now going on in research and development and design. If we don't make it more than just, changing from a petrol-driven vehicle for an individual to an electric vehicle driven by an individual. And so we've got to keep on fighting to make sure that the whole rethink of transport happens.
Awesome. And then one last question, which is how can people get in touch with you? So website, social media, emails, whatever you'd like.
Yeah, no. So we have a website, mobilityforafrica.com. We have also a US fund, which has a website. So we have many different entities, but you can follow us on LinkedIn, on Instagram, Twitter, Mobility for Africa, and you will find us.
Awesome. Well, Shantha, thanks so much for your time on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
To learn more about any of the guests that we have on the Bite Size podcast, you can check out our show notes at compassiot.substack.com. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the company that runs this podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is compassiot.com.au. Until next time.